There is a place in the far north of Russia where the ground keeps a secret. It sits on the Kola Peninsula, up past the Arctic Circle, close to the border with Norway, in a district called Pechensky. If you walked across that windswept plain today, you would pass the bones of an abandoned industrial site, broken concrete, twisted sheets of metal, the collapsed frame of a building with no roof and no glass left in its windows. And somewhere in that wreckage, set into a low concrete slab, you would find a heavy metal cap, roughly the size of a dinner plate, bolted down with a ring of thick steel bolts gone orange with rust. Most people who stumbled across it would never guess what it was. It looks like the lid of an old drain, something forgotten, something that never mattered. But directly beneath that little cap, dropping straight down into the oldest rock in Europe, is a shaft only 9 inches across, and that shaft reaches farther into the body of the planet than any hole human beings have ever made, more than 7.5 miles straight down, deeper than the lowest trench in any ocean, so deep that at the very bottom the rock is hot enough to ruin steel, and soft enough to slowly close over anything you lower into it, sealing the wound behind you. For decades, a strange story has followed this hole. People claimed the Soviets stopped drilling, not because the science ran out, but because of something they heard rising from the dark. A myth grew up that the drill had broken through into a great hidden space, and that microphones lowered into it picked up sounds no one could explain. The story spread far and wide, and it earned the hole a nickname that still haunts the internet today. But that story is false, and I want to be clear about that from the very start. What actually happened at the bottom of this hole is stranger than any ghost story, and far more important. Because the Soviet Union really did drill here, patiently, for about 20 years. They really did reach a depth no one has beaten before or since. And the planet really did fight them, in ways nobody had predicted, until it finally stopped them cold. This is the true story of the deepest hole ever dug into the earth, and of the people who spent their careers trying to reach a place we still have never touched. To understand why anyone would attempt something so difficult, you have to understand what was actually at stake. This was not a mine. Nobody was digging for gold or coal. It was not an oil well, though the technology was borrowed from the oil industry. A hole only 9 inches wide could never be any of those things. What it was, instead, was a race, and the prize was the inside of the world. For the whole of human history, we had lived on the thin outer skin of a planet whose interior we had never seen. We knew more about the surface of the moon, 250,000 miles away, than we knew about the rock a few miles beneath our own feet. Everything we believed about the deep crust, the layers of stone, and the boundary where the crust gives way to the mantle below, all of it was inferred. It was pieced together from earthquakes, from the way shockwaves bent and slowed as they traveled through the earth, from clever guesses and educated models. Nobody had ever gone down and looked. Nobody had ever held a piece of the deep crust in their hands. Whoever drilled deepest would change that. They would be the first people in history to touch stone from a place where no light had ever reached, rock that had been locked in darkness and pressure since before the first animals crawled out of the sea. And if a drill could be pushed far enough, it might one day punch clean through the crust and reach the mantle itself, the hot, slowly churning layer that drives earthquakes, feeds volcanoes, and shoves the continents across the face of the globe. Reaching the mantle would be, in scientific terms, like reaching another world without ever leaving your own. There was national pride wrapped around every meter of it as well. This was the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had stunned the world by launching the first satellite and then putting the first human being into orbit. But by the end of the 1960s, the Americans were about to win the greatest prize in the sky by landing men on the moon. If the race upward was slipping away, then the race downward, into the earth, was one the Soviet leadership meant to win outright. It would be proof that Soviet science and Soviet patience could reach where no other nation could follow. Before we go down into the dark, let me ask one quick thing of you. If you enjoy careful, deep dives into Cold War history and the strange, ambitious places it took us, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, even a single line, and share this video with someone who loves this kind of story. A small comment or a like tells the algorithm that a story like this one deserves to reach new people, and that support is the only reason work like this can continue. Thank you for that. Now, let us go back to the beginning of a contest almost nobody remembers. In the late 1950s and the early 1960s, everyone was looking up. The Soviets and the Americans were pouring their treasure into rockets and satellites and the dream of the moon. That is the space race, and it is famous. But there was a second race running quietly in the opposite direction, and it has been almost entirely forgotten. It was a race straight down. The Americans moved first. In 1958, a group of United States scientists proposed something bold. Rather than trying to grind through the enormously thick continental crust, they would go out to sea. Beneath the deep ocean floor, the Earth's crust is far thinner than it is under the continents. So the plan was to send a ship out over deep water, drill down through the ocean, and then punch through that thin oceanic crust to reach the mantle below. They named the project after the boundary they were chasing, the line where the crust ends and the mantle begins. It was an elegant idea. It was also, for the technology of that era, close to impossible. Picture the challenge. A ship floating on the open ocean, trying to hold itself almost perfectly still over a single point, while it lowered a slender string of pipe down through thousands of feet of moving water and then into the rock beneath, all without the whole apparatus swinging off target. And yet they managed a genuine first. They drilled a test hole about 601 feet into the seabed, under thousands of feet of ocean water. It was a real achievement, the opening move in humanity's attempt to reach its own interior. But that was as far as the Americans got. The project sank under rising costs and bitter arguments about how it should be run and who should run it. In 1966, the United States Congress lost patience and cut off the money. The American attempt was dead, and the mantle stayed exactly as far away as it had ever been. For both superpowers, this had always been about more than science alone. The inside of the Earth was seen as a frontier every bit as worthy as space, a place where a nation could prove the reach of its engineers and the confidence of its ideology. Yet the downward race carried none of the glory of the one playing out overhead. There were no launches to watch, no crackling voices from orbit, no flag planted where the whole world could see it. There was only a drill, turning slowly in the dark, thousands of feet beneath a patch of frozen ground, gaining on the unknown at the speed of a growing fingernail. It was, in every sense, the quietest race of the Cold War, and for a long time almost no one outside the field even knew it was being run. The Soviets had been watching all of this, and they decided to try the opposite approach. Not out at sea, not through the thin oceanic crust. They would stand on solid, ancient ground, on the thickest and most stable continental rock they could find, and they would simply drill straight down, deeper than anyone had ever gone, pulling up samples of the deep earth the entire way. It would be slower, it would be far harder, but if it worked, the record and the knowledge would be theirs alone. The great question was where to dig, and the answer they chose shaped everything that followed. They selected the Kola Peninsula, and they did it for a very specific reason, rooted in the geology beneath it. The peninsula sits on top of the Baltic Shield. A shield, in geology, is a vast slab of ancient rock, the exposed core of a continent. It is part of what geologists call a craton, the stable, barely moving heart of a landmass that has survived, more or less intact, for an almost unimaginable stretch of time. The rock of the Baltic Shield is Precambrian, meaning it formed before complex life existed, billions of years ago. It is granite and its close cousins. Cold, dense, and staggeringly old. At the spot the Soviets chose, the continental crust runs something like 35 kilometers deep before it even begins its slow transition toward the mantle. So even their grand target would carry them only about a third of the way through the crust at that location. They knew they were not going to reach the mantle here. That was never the realistic goal. What they wanted was to drive deeper into solid continent than anyone in history, and to read, layer by layer, what the deep crust was truly made of. But there was one more reason the shield was chosen, and it is the single most important assumption in this entire story, so hold on to it. The scientists reasoned that old, stable, undisturbed rock would be cold, and cold rock was the key to everything they hoped to do. As you descend into the earth, it grows hotter. That much was certain, and heat is the great enemy of any drill, because hot rock becomes soft rock, and soft rock will not hold a clean, open hole. So the logic seemed airtight. Choose a place where the crust was ancient and cool, and the temperature would climb slowly as they went down, letting them reach great depths before the heat became unbearable. On the Baltic Shield, they calculated, the rock at their target depth might sit at around 100 degrees Celsius. Hot, but manageable. That calculation felt like solid ground beneath the whole project. In time, it would betray them completely. The Soviets had actually attempted this kind of thing before, on a smaller scale. Earlier super-deep holes, given the designations SG-1 and SG-2, had been drilled elsewhere in the Soviet Union, one down in Kazakhstan and another in the south. Neither had even managed to reach 7 kilometers. Those were the rehearsals. Kola was meant to be the masterpiece, the one that would go deeper than all the others put together. The idea had been taking shape for years before the first bit ever touched the ground. It was proposed in the early 1960s and handed to a body with a suitably grand title, the Interdepartmental Scientific Council for the Study of the Earth's Interior and Super-Deep Drilling. The exact spot was chosen in 1965 on a low rise of Arctic tundra, and the years that followed were spent preparing for a task no one had ever attempted. A small working settlement grew up around the effort, tied to the nearby mining town of Zapolyani, roughly 10 kilometers away, a place built on the nickel that runs through this part of the far north. It was in Zapolyani that the precious cores would eventually be stored, cylinder after cylinder of the deep earth, catalogued and shelved like volumes in a library that only a handful of people on the planet would ever be able to read. On May 24, 1970, the drilling began. The date was not chosen at random. It fell in the year the Soviet Union marked the 100th anniversary of the birth of Lenin, and a project this grand was meant to carry the full weight of that moment. This was Soviet science reaching down into the Earth itself, a triumph to stand beside the triumphs in orbit. To understand what came next, you have to throw out whatever picture you carry of drilling a hole. This was nothing like pushing a straw into soft soil. It was an attempt to grind through miles of some of the hardest, oldest rock on the planet, using a cutting bit at the very end of a column of pipe that grew longer, heavier, and more fragile with every single meter of progress. Consider the physics of it. To spin the bit at the bottom, the old and simple method was to rotate the entire column of pipe from the surface, all the way down. But when your pipe is many kilometers long, the weight of that column becomes monstrous, well over 1 million pounds. Try to twist something that long and that heavy, and it stops behaving like a rigid steel rod and starts behaving like a strand of wet spaghetti. It wants to snap, it wants to tangle and coil, it wants to tear itself apart under its own weight. So the Soviets engineered a cleverer solution. They built a system in which the long string of pipe did not turn at all. Instead, they pumped drilling fluid down through the hollow pipe under enormous pressure, and that fluid drove a turbine mounted at the very bottom, just behind the bit. Only the tip rotated. The pipe simply hung there in the dark, kilometers long and perfectly still, while its far end quietly chewed at the oldest rock in Europe. To make a column that long survive its own length, they used special lightweight alloys, engineered to be as strong as possible while weighing as little as possible. It was some of the most advanced drilling hardware ever assembled, and even it would eventually fail. The bits themselves were small marvels. They were built from tungsten carbide for sheer toughness, and for the hardest granite, the crew used versions studded with industrial diamond, spun at speeds of roughly 100 to 200 turns a minute by the mud-driven turbine at the bottom. To keep the shaft cool and stable, they pumped a special clay-based drilling fluid down the pipe and back up again, carrying away the ground rock and the heat as it circulated. And because the samples deformed on the way up, and because so much of what mattered could only be measured in place, The Soviets had to invent logging instruments rugged enough to survive the pressure and the mounting heat at the bottom and still send back honest readings. Almost every part of this machine had to be created from nothing, because nothing built for ordinary drilling could survive where they were going. There was a second cruelty built into the whole enterprise. The point of this hole was science, which meant the crew did not just want a hole in the ground. They wanted the rock. They wanted continuous samples, real cylinders of stone brought up from every depth, so that geologists on the surface could hold the deep earth in their hands and study it directly. But rock that has spent billions of years crushed under miles of pressure does not enjoy being carried up into the light. As the samples rose and the pressure around them dropped away, they would sometimes crack, split, and deform before anyone could properly examine them. The planet resisted giving up its secrets intact. Now here is the detail that will make your patience ache just to hear it. That cutting bit, grinding away at the bottom of the world, lasted only about 4 hours before the heat and the punishing rock wore it out. 4 hours of actual cutting. And to change it, you could not simply reel it up like a fishing line. You had to haul the entire string of pipe out of the ground, one length at a time, unscrewing each section as it came up and laying it aside, for kilometre after kilometre after kilometre. Then you attached a fresh bit at the tip. Then you fed the whole enormous column back down, section by section, screwing it all together again, all the way to the bottom. Near the deepest point, a single round trip like that, all the way up and all the way back down, could swallow the better part of a day, sometimes more. And at the end of that entire brutal cycle, what had the crew earned? Another few hours of cutting before the bit dulled, and the whole ordeal began again. That is the true rhythm of the deepest hole ever drilled. Days of hauling for hours of progress. A few more millimeters of the planet, bought with an ocean of labor. It is one of the quietest, most stubborn acts of endurance in the history of engineering, and hardly anyone knows it happened. Now imagine keeping that up not for a season, not for a single year, but for 2 decades. Imagine a young engineer who joins the project in his 20s and gives it the whole of his working life, and still, when it finally ends, the whole is not finished. That was the reality of Kola. It was less like a sprint and more like the building of a medieval cathedral, a work so long that it outlives the people who begin it. The crews who cut the first meters in 1970 could not have known they were starting something that would still be grinding downward when the country that ordered it no longer existed. For the first several years, though, everything went beautifully. They started with a rig adapted from the oil fields, a machine called the Uralmash 4E, modified to reach around 7,000 meters. The bit cut down through the ancient granite almost eagerly. Kilometre after kilometre fell away beneath them. Within roughly 4 years, they had reached about 7,000 meters, and the project was living up to every promise made for it. To push deeper, they brought in something built for the purpose alone. It was a colossal rig called the Uralmash, 15,000, named directly after the new target depth of 15,000 meters. It stood inside a tower dozens of meters tall, an enormous and complicated machine, and it weighed hundreds of tons. Rising alone from that flat Arctic tundra, it looked as though the crust itself had grown a cathedral, a great spire of Soviet steel, aimed not at heaven, but at the center of the earth. And this was no secret buried in the shadows. The Kola borehole became a point of national pride, written up in the Soviet press, and even honored on a postage stamp. As the years passed and the records fell, it drew scientists from around the world, an international procession of geologists who traveled to this remote outpost to see the deepest hole on the planet and to study whatever it hauled up. For a time, a quiet camp on the edge of nowhere was one of the most important scientific sites on Earth. It is worth pausing on what daily life actually meant out there. This was the deep Arctic, far from any city, where winter brings weeks of near darkness and a cold that bites through everything. The crews worked in shifts around the great tower, hauling pipe, changing bits and nursing the machinery through its constant breakdowns. When a fresh core came up from the deep, it was carried the short distance into town and shelved in the repository, joining a slowly growing collection of stone drawn from depths no human had ever sampled. For the people who did this work, the borehole was never an abstraction. It was cold steel, long nights, and the endless mechanical rhythm of a machine chewing its way into the planet, one worn bit at a time. Then, on June 6, 1979, the project crossed a line that mattered enormously. The drill passed a depth of 9,583 meters. That number matters because it was the previous world record, set by an oil well in Oklahoma called Bertha Rogers. In a single stroke, the Soviets had drilled deeper than any human being in the entire history of the species. The record was theirs, taken cleanly, while the abandoned wreck of the American Ocean Project lay years behind them, a reminder of the rival who had tried this and walked away. The finish line, 15,000 meters, suddenly felt close enough to touch. They had gone from empty tundra to the deepest hole on Earth. Only about a third of the way remained. The rock was cooperating. The great machine was working. Foreign scientists were making the long journey north to admire what had been built. Everything about the project whispered the word triumph. And that is exactly when the Earth changed its temper. Somewhere past the 7-kilometer mark, the ground stopped behaving. The granite that had cut so cleanly in the early years grew more fractured and more broken, shot through with cracks. And, impossibly, it was wet. There was water down there, kilometers into rock that every model insisted should be dry and sealed and solid. We will come back to that water, because it turned out to be one of the great surprises of the whole project. But for the crew in that moment, it meant one thing above all. Fractured, water-soaked rock will not hold a clean, narrow shaft. It wants to crumble inward and collapse. The drill began to wander. Instead of driving straight down like an arrow, it slipped and deflected off the harder and softer patches, and the crew had to fight, meter by meter, just to keep the hole anywhere near vertical. Bits broke. The path bent. Sections of the wall crumbled and rained debris down into the shaft. To cope, the crew was forced, again and again, to back up, seal off a troublesome stretch, and start a fresh branch angling away from higher in the hole, then drill down through untouched rock all over again. Over the years, this happened so many times that the borehole stopped being a single clean line and became a whole family of holes, several branches splitting away from one central shaft. The deepest of them received the designation SG3, and that is the branch that holds the record. When the geologists later mapped the true shape of everything they had drilled, all the branches and side tracks tangled together beneath the tundra, they compared it to a crooked tree, or to the forking limbs of a fir tree spreading out in the dark. The deepest hole in the world is not a straight line at all. It is a frozen bolt of lightning made of failed and re-drilled paths, each fork a monument to a place where the Earth pushed back and won. And then came the disaster that nearly ended everything. On September 27, 1984, the hole had reached 12,066 meters. The crew had recently returned to cutting at the bottom after a pause. As the immense column of pipe turned in the deep, something down in the dark gave way. A section of the drill string, around 5 kilometers of it, twisted apart and stayed down there, jammed and dead in the hole. Sit with what that sentence really describes. 5 kilometers of steel and alloy pipe, more than 3 miles of it, sheared off and abandoned at the bottom of the deepest hole ever drilled. One of the geologists on the project later described what the conditions do to metal down there. He said the pipe, under the unbelievable stress, had begun to stretch, like rubber, drawing out and thinning before it finally failed. That is what the deep earth does to some of the strongest hardware human beings can build. It pulls steel like warm candy, and then snaps it. 5 kilometers of pipe, gone, unrecoverable, plugging the deepest part of a shaft that had taken 14 years to reach. There was no way to fish it out. The only option was to seal off the ruined lower section and start again, drilling a fresh branch off the side from a point several kilometers up, then grinding back down into the deep to recover all the ground they had lost. Years of the hardest drilling on Earth, undone in a single afternoon, and now to be drilled a second time. That single blow would have finished a lesser effort. Instead, the crew set their jaws, sidetracked around the wreckage, and began the long descent all over again. They still believed 15,000 meters lay within reach. They were about to learn what was truly waiting for them in the deep. And here is where the real treasure of this project comes into view. Treasure that has nothing to do with any myth. Because as the drill fought its way back down through that fractured, weeping ancient rock, it kept sending up samples and readings, and those samples were quietly demolishing what the textbooks claimed should be true. The scientists at Kola lived inside their discoveries one confusing core sample at a time, without the full picture. You, listening now, decades later, with all the results laid out, can understand what they found more clearly than the exhausted crew did as they hauled pipe out of the frozen ground in the polar dark. So let me hand you what this hole actually pulled up from the deep, because each discovery forced scientists to rewrite a page of what we thought we knew about the planet beneath our feet. Start with the water. The models had been confident that the deep crust, kilometers down, would be dry, sealed, and solid. Instead, at depths spanning several kilometers, the crew found free-flowing water moving through the rock. Fluids were detected down to around 11 kilometers, mostly where the drill cut through large zones of fractured stone. And here is the part that made geologists sit up straight. This was not rainwater or groundwater that had trickled down from the surface. A layer of impermeable rock overhead had sealed surface water out entirely. This water had come from below. It had been squeezed directly out of the minerals in the deep rock itself, under the crushing pressure, chemically wrung from stone over spans of time we can barely comprehend, and then trapped down there because nothing above would let it rise. In a very real sense, it was water that had never once seen the sky. It had formed in the deep and waited in the dark until a Soviet drill bit finally set it free. And the water did not come up alone. As the drill worked, gases came bubbling up the shaft. Hydrogen rose in such quantities that the drilling mud pouring out at the surface appeared to boil and froth, alive with it. Along with the hydrogen came helium, nitrogen, and carbon dioxide, a whole exhalation seeping out of rock that the textbooks had assumed would be inert and silent. The planet, it turned out, was breathing down there, slowly and steadily, in a place no one had expected any breath at all. There were subtler treasures as well, found only much later, when researchers examined the samples in fine detail. Sealed inside tiny pockets of fluid, trapped in the deep rock, some of it locked away roughly 1.7 billion years ago, they found unusually rich traces of gold. Not veins or nuggets, but gold scattered as particles almost too small to picture. It was a quiet reminder that the deep crust is not dead or empty. It is a slow chemical factory that has been at work for billions of years, and the borehole had opened a rare direct window onto that hidden machinery. Then there were the fossils. At a depth of around 6.7 kilometers, more than 4 miles straight down, in rock roughly 2 billion years old, the crew found the microscopic remains of ancient life. 24 distinct species of tiny, single-celled sea organisms, a form of plankton, preserved in the deep, and they were not simple imprints pressed into stone. These delicate microfossils had been wrapped and protected inside compounds of carbon and nitrogen, an organic packaging that had somehow shielded them from the crushing pressure and the rising heat well enough that they survived, recognizable, across 2 billion years. Consider that, the fragile traces of living things, sitting intact miles below the surface, sealed in rock, older than almost anything that has ever walked, crawled or swum on the face of this world. The hole was not only a record of stone, it was an archive of ancient life, buried where no one had thought to look for it. But the discovery that struck at the very foundations of geology was the one about a missing layer. For generations, scientists had believed that as you descend through the continental crust, you eventually cross a boundary, somewhere around 6 or 7 kilometers down, where the rock changes character. Granite in the upper crust, they thought, would give way to a denser rock more like basalt below. This was not a wild guess. It came from seismic surveys. When earthquakes send shockwaves rippling through the earth, those waves speed up or slow down depending on the rock they pass through. Geologists had detected a clear change in wave speed at about that depth all across the continents, and a change in speed, they reasoned, must mean a change in rock. So a granite to basalt boundary went into the textbooks as settled fact. The Soviets drilled down towards 7 kilometers, fully expecting, at last, to break out of the granite and into the basalt below. The basalt was not there. It was never there. Instead, the drill kept pulling up granite, and more granite, going down and down well past the depth where the great boundary was supposed to sit. The seismic signal had been perfectly real. The wave speed truly did change at that depth, but the reason was completely different from what everyone had assumed. It was not a change from one kind of rock to another. It was the same granite all the way, transformed at depth by the ferocious pressure and heat, and, crucially, cracked and soaked with the very water we just talked about. Fractured, water-filled granite carries seismic waves differently than solid granite does. That is what the earthquakes had been detecting all along, not a new layer of stone, a wounded and waterlogged one. That vanished boundary even had a name. Geologists had long called it the Conrad discontinuity, and it was supposed to mark the line where lighter granite gave way to denser rock below. Kohler quietly erased it from the picture. What the drill actually passed through, from roughly 5 to 10 kilometers down, was a thick seam of metamorphic rock, granite, and related stone that had been cooked and squeezed and altered by depth without ever turning into basalt. Along the way, the borehole also cut across major fault zones, ancient fractures in the crust, and it was often at and around these shattered, fluid-filled zones that the strangest findings clustered. The deep crust, it turned out, was not a tidy stack of neat layers at all. It was a single vast body of extremely old rock, cracked, folded, soaked, and transformed, far more complicated than any clean textbook diagram had ever suggested. Think about the scale of that correction. A boundary drawn in geology textbooks around the world, believed to be a feature of every continent, was quietly revealed to be a misreading of the evidence. And it was one narrow Soviet hole in the Arctic that proved it. That, far more than any depth record, is what the Kohler borehole was truly for. Not to break through to anything hidden. To find out, by going down and looking, just how wrong we had been. So this is what the crew was actually doing in the deep. Not opening a door to any underworld. They were reading the oldest pages of the planet's own diary, and finding that the diary said things almost no one had believed. But the deeper they read, the closer they drew to the one obstacle they could not sidetrack around, could not out-engineer, and could not survive. In 1989, after painstakingly re-drilling everything the disaster had cost them, the SG3 branch reached its greatest depth, 12,262 meters. Say that slowly. 12,262 meters. That is 7.5 miles, straight down, through the most ancient rock in Europe. It is deeper than the lowest point in any ocean on the planet, the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, which bottoms out at about 11,034 meters. If you could somehow lower Mount Everest into this shaft, the entire mountain would vanish beneath the surface with room to spare. Nothing humans have drilled, before that day or since, has ever gone deeper into the earth. And this was the moment they struck the wall. Not a wall of rock, a wall of heat. Remember the assumption, remember the whole reason they had chosen this cold ancient shield in the first place, so that the temperature would climb slowly and let them reach 15,000 meters, while the rock stayed near 100 degrees Celsius. For the first few kilometers, that promise held. The temperature rose with depth at roughly the rate the planners had predicted, tracking their model down to around 3,000 meters. Everyone felt reassured. Then, below that, the rock began to outpace the forecast. The heat climbed faster, and by the time the drill reached the bottom of SG3, the temperature of the rock was not the comfortable 100 degrees Celsius they had planned around. It was 180 degrees Celsius. That is 356 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly double what the models had promised at that depth. The crust beneath Kola was running almost twice as hot as it was supposed to. And at 180 degrees, everything came apart, in the most literal way imaginable. The rock down there stopped behaving like solid stone, under that combination of ferocious heat and monstrous pressure, and made worse by rock that had grown more porous and less dense than expected at those depths. The stone turned ductile, plastic. It behaved less like granite and more like something soft and slow-flowing, like thick, warm putty. When the drill cut into it, the rock refused to stay cut. It crept and oozed back into the freshly opened hole, trying to close the wound as fast as the crew could open it. The drill bits deformed in the heat, the pipes warped. Every meter now had to be won against a planet that was actively healing itself shut behind them. Do the arithmetic on their dream. The goal was 15,000 meters. They stopped at 12,262. They fell more than 2.5 kilometers short of their own target, a gap they would never close, because the deeper they pushed, the hotter and softer the rock became, and there was no drilling technology anywhere on Earth, not then and not now, that could hold a clean hole open in rock that hot for any sustained length of time. Every meter gained, the planet tried to take back. They did not surrender easily. They kept fighting the heat for years. In January of 1991, they began a fresh branch, angling off from around 9,653 meters down, still hoping to find a path to greater depth. But the heat defeated that attempt too. In 1992, that branch was stopped at 11,882 meters, beaten once again by temperatures of 180 degrees Celsius. There was no clever fix, no new alloy, no trick of engineering could win against physics itself. The planet had drawn a hard line, at 180 degrees and around 12,000 meters, and no matter what these people tried, it would not let them past. That, and nothing supernatural, is the real reason the deepest hole on Earth stops exactly where it stops. Not a cavity, not a chamber of fire, not a single sound from anywhere but the rock itself, just stone, too hot to hold a hole, quietly flowing shut in the dark. And yet, while the drilling was being defeated by the Earth, the story of Kola was escaping into the wider world and turning into something the scientists never intended. Because the project was a Soviet state effort, wrapped in the usual secrecy, and because it involved a genuinely eerie fact, a hole 7.5 miles deep into rock, hot enough to wreck equipment, it became the perfect seed for a myth. The tale that spread claimed that scientists had drilled into a great hidden space in the rock, that the temperature down there was many times hotter than anything real, and that when they lowered listening equipment into the void, they recorded strange and disturbing sounds. From there the legend grew arms and legs. It moved from small religious newsletters to tabloid pages to the early internet, where an audio clip circulated for years, presented as a recording from the pit. None of it was true, and the trail of how the lie was built is fascinating in its own right. The real project sat on the Kola Peninsula in the northwest, near Norway, not off in some vague Siberian wilderness as many versions claimed. The real depth was around 12 kilometers, not the exaggerated figures the story tossed around. The real temperature at the bottom was 180 degrees Celsius, hot, but nowhere near had the fantastical numbers had the legend invented. The real scientists reported no hidden cavity and no mysterious voices, because the rock at that depth was not hollow. It was flowing shut, and the eerie audio that traveled the internet for years was eventually traced to layered and looped sound effects, with parts of it identified as coming from an old horror film. So where did the story actually begin? People who chased it back to its roots found something telling. The trail does not run through any respected scientific journal, even though the legend always claimed it did. It runs through small circulation religious newsletters, retold from memory, each version a little more dramatic than the one before. At the very root of the real events was a sober, accurate article about the Kola drilling, written by the Soviet Minister of Geology himself, a man named Yevgeny Kozlovsky, and published in a respected American science magazine in 1984. That article was true. It described real rock, real depths, and real temperatures around 180 degrees Celsius. No voids, no voices. But somewhere in the retelling, that honest report got tangled up with the ancient idea of a pit beneath our feet, and the details mutated. The location drifted, the depth inflated, the temperature exploded into fantasy, and the sounds and the hidden chamber were simply invented and welded on. The tale eventually crossed the ocean, and in 1989, an American religious television network broadcast a version of it to a wide audience, presenting the invented recording as literal proof of a place of torment beneath the ground. Then it got one more push. A Norwegian teacher who heard that broadcast was so struck by how readily people believed it that he deliberately added an even wilder embellishment of his own and fed it back to the broadcasters, curious to see whether they would repeat it. They did. He later admitted the whole thing had been a test of how far a falsehood would travel when it was frightening enough. And travel it did. It has outlived the Soviet Union itself. It jumped from broadcasts to newspapers to websites, where the fake audio spread from one page to the next. It inspired horror films. It resurfaces on social media every few years, dressed up as a chilling true account, complete with the same recycled sound, and every time a fresh wave of people believes it. Here is what that tells us, and it is the most human part of the whole affair. The single deepest scientific achievement of the entire downward race, a whole that rewrote real textbooks, is remembered by most of the world not for its trapped water, or its ancient fossils, or its missing basalt layer, but for a ghost story bolted on by people who never went anywhere near it. The real discoveries were quiet, technical, and true. The invented one was loud, simple, and frightening. And that is precisely why the invention won the public memory. A story about being wrong regarding the density and structure of granite does not spread across the planet. A story about a terrifying pit beneath our feet spreads everywhere and lasts for generations, because it reaches something older than science, the ancient dread every culture has felt about what might lie beneath the ground. The truth never really stood a chance against a tale that vivid. So what genuinely happened to the hole in the end? Not terror, not a frantic escape, something far more human and in its own way far sadder. The record depth was reached in 1989. The crew kept working the deepest branches into the early 1990s, still hunting for any way past the heat, and then history did to the project what the rock alone had not quite managed. At the end of 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The entire state that had conceived this hole, funded it, wrapped it in national pride, and sustained it for 2 decades, simply ceased to exist. The new Russia that emerged inherited a shattered economy and 1,000 more urgent priorities than a scientific hole in the Arctic that had already fallen short of its goal. The money evaporated almost overnight. Serious deep drilling ended around 1992. There was one last, shallower attempt. In April of 1994, the crew started a new branch from about 8,278 meters, but it was stopped that same year at around 8,578 meters, abandoned for simple lack of funds. In 1995, the drilling program was formally shut down. For a while, the site lingered on in a reduced form, kept as a kind of deep laboratory where the exposed rock could still be studied. But the great push into the deep was finished forever. In the years that followed, the scientific team was cut down and eventually, by 2007, dissolved, and much of the equipment was handed off and partly scrapped. The giant tower, that cathedral of steel that had stood over the deepest point on Earth for a generation, was taken down. The buildings were left to the Arctic to reclaim. Windows shattered, roofs sagged and collapsed, wooden structures rotted where they stood, metal rusted, and the snow blew in through the gaps, year after year, until the whole place looked less like a laboratory and more like the aftermath of some quiet catastrophe. And the hole itself, that 9-inch shaft holding the world record, was capped. Someone bolted a heavy metal lid over the top, sealed it against the weather, and walked away. There was no dramatic final moment, no alarm, no terrified evacuation, only budgets running dry, a country coming apart, and a slow, quiet abandonment. Spare a real thought for the people. For about 20 years, geologists and drillers and engineers lived and worked at the edge of the Arctic, through the long polar winters, to do something no human being had ever done. Many of them gave the better part of their entire working lives to this one narrow hole. They did not simply push a drill into the ground. They invented drilling methods that had never existed. They solved problems no one had ever faced. They built machines able to operate miles below the surface in conditions that stretched steel like rubber. They pulled up water that had never seen the sky, gases that made the mud boil, fossils 2 billion years old, and proof that a boundary drawn in every geology textbook was an illusion. And what has been their reward in the memory of the world? For most of them, anonymity. Their names are known to a handful of specialists and almost no one else. Their patient, staggering 20-year achievement is remembered by the general public, when it is remembered at all, through a hoax about sounds from a pit that never existed. They did not find any underworld. They found something far rarer and far more valuable. They went looking honestly, and they discovered that they had been wrong about their own planet. To be willing to find out you are wrong, and to keep drilling anyway, is the entire point of science. These people paid for that knowledge with decades of the hardest, slowest, most patient labor imaginable, in one of the least forgiving corners of the earth. You might assume that in all the years since, with all our modern technology, someone must surely have gone deeper. We build machines now that would have seemed like magic in 1970. The record must have fallen by now. It has not. Not the true vertical record. Not the deepest point into the planet. There have been serious challenges. In Germany, a deep continental drilling program in the region of Bavaria pushed down to around 9,101 meters before the rock temperature climbed past 260 degrees Celsius and forced the crew to stop, beaten by the very same enemy that had defeated the Soviets. Heat. Some oil and gas wells drilled in later years, in places like the Middle East and off the coast of Russia, actually run longer along their total length than Kola does, but they reach that length by angling sideways and curving through the ground for miles. Measured straight down, in true vertical depth into the body of the planet, none of them comes close to Kola. That 9-inch shaft in the Arctic remains, to this day, the deepest point human beings have ever reached inside their own world. It is worth being precise about the record, because it is often muddled. There are two different things you can measure. One is the total length of the bore, followed along however it twists and bends. The other is true vertical depth, the straight line down toward the center of the planet. Kola held both crowns for decades. Then, in 2008, an oil well in Qatar edged past it in total measured length, and a few years later, another far-reaching well, drilled off the Russian island of Sakhalin, ran longer still. But those wells win their length by curving sideways through the ground for miles in the hunt for oil. Straight down, the mark has never moved. Measured as pure depth into the body of the Earth, the deepest hole in the world is still the one the Soviets stopped drilling more than 3 decades ago. The dream itself has not died, though. In just the last few years, China has been drilling an enormous scientific and exploratory borehole in a desert basin in its northwest, driving down past 10,000 meters, punching through layer after layer of rock and chasing formations hundreds of millions of years old. The tools are far more advanced than anything the Soviets possessed. The rock is different, and the goals mix pure science with the search for resources. But the underlying ambition is exactly the one that drove the crew at Kola. Go down, go deeper than anyone before, see what is truly there, instead of guessing at it from the surface. And still, after all of it, after the American attempt at sea, after Kola, after Germany, after everything drilled since, we have never once touched the mantle. Kola reached only about a third of the way through the crust at that spot, and the crust is merely the thin outer rind of the planet. To grasp how little of the Earth we have truly touched, consider the proportions. From the surface down to the center of the planet is a journey of about 4,000 miles. The Kola shaft, the deepest we have ever managed, reaches less than 1,000th of that distance. It did not even clear the crust where it was drilled, cutting only about a third of the way through before the heat won. We have scratched the outermost skin of the world, and no more. Every serious attempt to go deeper runs headlong into the same wall the Kola crew hit. Descend far enough, and the earth simply becomes too hot, and hot rock refuses to hold an open hole. Heat is the gatekeeper, and so far it has never been beaten. And the prize on the far side of that gate would be immense. The boundary where the crust finally gives way to the mantle even has a name. Geologists call it the Mohorovičić discontinuity, usually shortened simply to the MOHO. To bring up a fresh piece of the mantle would be to hold the engine of our planet in your hands, a fragment of the layer whose slow churning cracks continents apart, raises mountain ranges, and opens ocean floors. It would settle scientific arguments that have run for generations. No one has ever done it. Every road toward the mantle, by land or by sea, has so far ended in the same place, stopped by heat, by pressure, by cost, or by politics. And although the drilling ended long ago, the knowledge it produced did not. The cores stacked in that northern repository and the mountain of measurements the project generated are still studied by geologists today, decades later. The failed American venture at sea, for all its disappointment, seeded a long line of ocean drilling programs that carried on for many years afterward. Germany's deep borehole leaned on hard-won lessons about heat and instruments. Nearly every serious attempt to read the deep earth since has stood, in part, on what Kola proved and on what it warned against. A project that fell short of its own dream became a permanent benchmark for everyone who followed. Let that contrast settle for a moment. Human beings have walked on the surface of the moon. We have landed machines on Mars and driven them across its deserts. We have flown a spacecraft past every planet in our solar system and out into the dark between the stars. And yet we have never, not one single time, drilled all the way through the thin crust of the very world we are standing on. The center of our own planet, the ground beneath your feet at this exact moment, is in a real sense harder to reach than the far side of the moon. Which brings us back to that rusting metal cap out on the tundra, the one you would mistake for the lid of an old drain. It is easy to walk past, it is easy to dismiss. But beneath it lies the single deepest mark humanity has ever pressed into its own planet, a 9-inch line reaching 7.5 miles down toward a center we still cannot touch. The Soviet crews who made it did not break through to anything monstrous. They broke through, instead, to a truer picture of the world, and they paid for it with 20 years of their lives. The hole is quiet now. There is nothing down there listening, and there never was. What remains is simpler than any legend, and, if you think about it honestly, more remarkable. A country that no longer exists once decided to ask the planet a direct question, and it spent 2 decades and the whole of a generation's patience trying to hear the answer. The Earth answered in the only language it has, in stone and water and heat, and then, at 180 degrees and 12,262 meters down, it closed its door and would say no more. The people packed up, welded a lid over their deepest question, and left it there in the snow. And it has waited, sealed and silent, ever since, holding a record that no one on Earth has yet found a way to break.